It begins with a cough, not the harsh bark of battlefield lungs or the dry rasp of recycled air, but something wetter, something that lingers. A tickle that roots itself deep in the back of your throat, like a seed waiting to bloom. At first, you think nothing of it. In the Hive cities, everyone coughs. The air is thick with industrial particulates. The water tastes faintly of rust and recycled chemicals. Every body pressed against you in the transit corridors carries 1,000 invisible diseases. A cough means nothing, less than nothing, but this one stayed. I was a medic orderly in the underhive of Tertius Magna when it began, level 700. Deep enough that the air tasted of metal and despair, but not so deep that hope had completely withered away. Our clinic served the laborers and the factory hands, the countless millions who fed the Imperium's war machine with blood, sweat, and shortened lives. Down there, we saw everything. Radiation sickness, chemical burns, mutations whispered about in corners but treated in silence. I thought I understood suffering. I was wrong. The first patient came on a Tuesday. I remember, because Tuesdays were slow, a brief lull between the weekend injuries and the midweek industrial disasters. She was young, maybe 20 standard years old, with the pale complexion of someone who worked endless night shifts in the protein processing plants. She came in for the cough, she said. It had been getting worse for weeks. When she opened her mouth to show me, I noticed the first signs. Her gums had taken on a faint greenish tint, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. The saliva pooling at the corners of her lips was thicker than normal, almost oily, catching the clinic light in a strange, wrong shimmer. Her breath carried a sweetness that turned my stomach, like flowers left rotting in stagnant water. I prescribed a standard antibiotic course and sent her home. The symptoms would pass, I told her. They always did. 3 days later, she returned. The cough was worse, harsher, deeper, but what concerned me were the lesions forming along her arms. Small at first, no larger than coin slots, yet the edges seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive with their own heartbeat. The surrounding skin had grown waxy and translucent. When I pressed gently to examine, a clear fluid seeped out. It smelled faintly of decay, and something else, something that made my mouth water in a way that horrified me. I referred her to the upper levels, to a Medici station with proper equipment and sterilized air. But she never arrived. By the time the transport came, she was laughing, not the bitter laugh of hive dwellers who find humor in hopelessness, but something deeper. It rose from her gut, bubbling up through layers of infection like a hymn to madness. She said the pain was gone, that she felt peaceful for the first time in years. The transport crew found her 3 hours later, lying in an alley 2 blocks from the clinic. Dead, or so they thought. When they moved her body, her eyes opened. She smiled. The report was classified. The body was incinerated. The incident was forgotten. But I remembered. And more importantly, I had been in that room with her. I had breathed her air, touched her skin, heard her laughter. The seed had been planted. My cough began 3 days later. At first, I tried to treat myself. Professional pride demanded it. The alternative meant admitting that something was happening beyond my understanding or control. I ran my own blood work, analyzed tissue samples, administered every antibiotic we had in our meager arsenal. Every test came back normal, better than normal, in fact. My white blood cell count was elevated, but not in the way infection would suggest. It looked efficient, optimized. My cardiovascular markers were perfect. My metabolism was running clean, strong, alive. Almost too alive. By every measurable standard, I was the image of perfect health, except for the cough and the dreams. Sleep had never come easily in the underhive. The endless hum of machinery, the distant echoes of violence, the oppressive knowledge that millions of souls were crammed together in a structure groaning beneath its own weight, all of it made rest a fragile, fleeting thing. Yet now, when sleep finally came, it brought visions that felt more real than waking life. I dreamed of gardens stretching beyond sight, vast and radiant, where plants grew from corpses and bore fruit that pulsed like hearts. Towering trees wept sap the color of pus, their bark slick and feverish. Their leaves whispered in languages I had never learned but somehow understood, words that sank into my mind like ancient prayers. And in those dreams, I walked among the flowers. They reached for me, tendrils warm and soft against my skin, and their touch filled me with a comfort I had never known. The air shimmered with spores that made my lungs feel pure, almost reborn, as if decades of poison had been washed away. At the center of it all stood a presence, immense beyond reason, yet deeply personal. It watched me with eyes like weeping wounds and loved me with a love that was patient, eternal, and utterly complete. Each morning, I woke feeling renewed despite restless sleep. My skin tingled, my veins hummed with life, and for a few brief moments, the colorless despair of the underhive melted into something warm, green, and alive. But as the memory of the dreams slipped away, reality crept back, bringing with it the cough and the unsettling sense that something inside me was quietly, inevitably changing. The symptoms came slowly at first. A faint discoloration under my fingernails, a subtle thickening of the skin around my joints, small enough to dismiss, signs of exhaustion, poor diet, too many hours breathing recycled air. But the cough grew stronger, and what I began to expel was different. It wasn't phlegm. It was thicker, viscous, glistening faintly under the clinic lights. It carried that same cloying sweetness I'd noticed on my patient's breath. Under the microscope, it revealed impossible things, cellular formations shaped like blooming flowers, their translucent petals pulsing with their own rhythm. When I attempted to culture the samples, they grew, voraciously, joyfully, in defiance of every rule of microbiology I knew. They multiplied with purpose, weaving themselves into intricate, radiant lattices. And they were beautiful. That was the worst part. I would stare at the slides for hours, mesmerized by their symmetry, the way light played through the translucent membranes. I knew what they meant. I knew what they were doing to me. Yet I couldn't look away. They were alive in a way human cells had never been. Vital, purposeful, unburdened by fear or decay. Soon, the others began to notice changes. Dr. Matthias, the senior physician, remarked that my bedside manner had improved. Patients who had once been restless or uncooperative grew calm when I approached. I moved through the wards with a patience I had never possessed, genuinely listening, feeling their pain as though it resonated through my own nerves. One regular, Mrs. Corv, a weary laborer whose joints had been destroyed by factory work, said my hands felt different when I examined her. Warmer, she told me. More alive. She began to sleep through the night again. Her appetite returned. I told her it was all psychological, the power of attention, of empathy. But deep down, I knew better. My touch was changing people, not curing them, not exactly, but transforming their understanding of pain itself. They stopped resisting it. They began to accept it, to find meaning in it, to see suffering as something sacred, a bridge to something vast and unseen. And as I watched them, as I felt the pulse of their pain harmonize with mine, I began to understand that truth myself. Pain was no longer a symptom. It was a conversation. The revelation came during a night shift in the month of Taurus. The clinic was quiet, eerily so. Most of our patients had drifted into that uneasy half-sleep that passed for rest in the underhive. The hum of filtration units and the faint groan of the metal superstructure were the only sounds left. I was finishing my final rounds when I heard it. Singing, the voice came from the isolation ward. We reserved that place for the hopeless cases, those too dangerous, too strange, or too close to death to be left among the living. Normally, it was silent, save for the rhythmic pulse of life support machines and the soft whimpers of the dying. But tonight, the air was alive with music. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, a rich contralto that filled the ward like incense, resonating through the corrugated steel walls until the space itself seemed transformed into a cathedral. The melody was unfamiliar, yet ancient, layered with harmonies that pressed against my chest and drew tears to my eyes. As I followed the sound, I realized it came from Bed 7, Bed 7 belonged to Jeremiah Cord, a factory worker who'd been caught in a spill of industrial acids 3 weeks before. The chemicals had eaten through skin and muscle, leaving bone exposed in places. Infection had followed, and by all logic, he should have been dead days ago. But Jeremiah had lingered, suspended somewhere between life and whatever came after. When I entered his room, he was sitting upright. He shouldn't have been able to move at all. Yet there he was, humming softly through shredded lungs. His burns were no longer raw. The flesh had changed. From the blackened tissue sprouted tiny organic structures, pale growths like miniature fungi or sea anemones, each swaying gently as he breathed. From their centers pulsed a faint phosphorescent glow, washing the room in a sickly green light that danced across the walls. He turned toward me, and I froze. His eyes, once brown, were clouded over, cataracts shifting like living organisms across the surface. And yet I knew, with absolute certainty, that he could see me. Not merely see, but perceive me, my heartbeat, my fear, the infection blooming inside my blood. "You hear it too, don't you?" he asked. His voice wasn't just his own. The tones rippled through the growths across his body, harmonizing with themselves. The song. It's always been there. We were simply too healthy to listen. I wanted to deny it, to cling to the pretense that this was still a medical matter, something that could be cataloged, treated, cured. But I could hear it. The melody was everywhere, in the walls, in the vents, in the heartbeat of the hive itself. A song of growth and decay, life feeding on death, and death returning the favor. It started with a cough. I murmured without meaning to. Jeremiah smiled, and for an instant, his ruined face seemed almost holy. "It always does," he said. "The grandfather is patient. He doesn't force his gifts. He waits until we're ready to receive them." "This isn't a gift," I replied, but the words lacked conviction. "It's a disease, a corruption." "Is it?" He gestured toward the luminous colonies thriving across his ruined skin. "I haven't felt pain in days. My thoughts are clear. For the first time, I understand my place in the great cycle. Tell me, doctor, how was that corruption?" I could have argued. I could have cited medical texts, doctrines of purity, sermons from the ecclesiarchy warning of chaos and contagion. But standing there, bathed in that soft green light, I couldn't speak. Because somewhere beneath the hum of machines and the chorus of spores, I could hear it too, the song of something vast, patient, and terribly alive. Standing in that room, breathing air thick with spores and strange perfumes, watching a man who should have been long dead sing hymns that stirred something ancient inside me, I began to question everything I thought I knew. The changes within my own body were accelerating. The cough no longer brought up phlegm, but matter that looked more garden than human. My skin had taken on a faint greenish hue, especially around the joints and the thinnest parts of my flesh. When I stared into a mirror, I saw gold flecks in my eyes, tiny motes that seemed to drift and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Yet it wasn't the physical transformation that disturbed me most, it was my perception. The world had begun to bloom in ways I'd never imagined. I could see the invisible threads connecting all things, the way decay nourished growth, and how growth, in time, surrendered again to decay. The suffering I witnessed daily in the clinic no longer felt meaningless. It was part of a vast and beautiful pattern, an endless cycle of transformation, and I was beginning to understand my place within it. The dreams no longer waited for sleep. In the quiet hours, while reviewing patient files or refilling medical stores, I would slip effortlessly into that impossible garden. The visions grew clearer, more vivid. I could feel the soft loam beneath my feet, rich black soil made from generations of decomposed life. The air was sweet with pollen that made my lungs sing. And always, there was the presence, vast, patient, and loving, watching over the rhythm of growth and decay. But I was no longer an observer. I was part of the process. In those dreams, I tended to the sick who came seeking healing. Yet the healing I offered was unlike the sterile restoration of function that medicine demanded. Instead, I guided them toward acceptance, to see their pain not as an enemy, but as a message from something greater. A man whose abdomen had been devoured by cancer learned to find wonder in the new sensations it brought. A woman whose lungs were corroded by industrial poisons discovered that each painful breath carried her closer to peace. They left the garden transformed, not cured, but freed. They understood that life and death were not opposites, but partners, locked in a sacred dance that had begun the moment the first cell divided and one organism consumed another. When I returned from these visions, I found myself applying the same philosophy in the clinic. Patients with chronic pain or wasting illnesses began to improve, though not in the ways they expected. Their symptoms remained, but their fear dissolved. Their agony persisted, yet they spoke of sleeping soundly for the first time in years. They left not healed, but accepting, whole, in a different sense. Dr. Matthias noticed. He called me into his office one Thursday evening after the last patient had been discharged. The conversation that followed would have ended any ordinary career. Your methods, he began carefully, are becoming unorthodox. His tone was curious, not yet condemning. Patients are reporting unusual experiences after seeing you. Dreams of gardens. A sense of peace regarding their conditions, he said, scanning the reports. Mrs. Havel claims her arthritis no longer troubles her. Not because the pain is gone, but because she's learned to love it. Pain can be a teacher, I replied. Modern medicine treats it as an enemy to be conquered. But what if we've been wrong all along? What if pain isn't punishment but communication? What if discomfort is the body's way of revealing truths we've been too frightened to face? He studied me for a long, silent moment. Under the harsh light of his office, I wondered if the changes in my appearance were beginning to show. The faint greenish tint of my skin, the way my hair had started to grow in strange, organic patterns that defied any natural order. If he noticed, he gave no sign. His face remained carefully neutral. There are reports from other districts, he said at last, his tone cautious. Doctors changing their methods. Clinics adopting new philosophies of care. The administratum is beginning to take notice. A cold shiver passed through me, one that had nothing to do with the chill of the recycled air. The administratum's attention was never a blessing, especially when it involved deviation from the sacred doctrines of the Imperium. And yet, beneath the unease, I felt something else stirring. Anticipation. The transformation wasn't mine alone. Others were waking to the same truth, seeing the pattern behind the veil. The revelation was spreading, quietly, beautifully, like roots through soil. What do you intend to do? I asked. That depends, he said softly. Are you still the same man I hired 6 years ago? Or have you become something else? The question hung in the air like a blade suspended between us. I could have lied. I could have told him I was still the dutiful medic, obedient and unquestioning, loyal to the Emperor and to the letter of Imperial protocol. But looking into his face, into the tired eyes of a man who had spent his life tending wounds that never healed, I realized that a lie would be the greater betrayal. I'm still me, I said slowly, but I see the world differently now. The body isn't a machine to be repaired. It's a garden that must be tended. And sometimes, I paused, the most beautiful flowers grow from the darkest soil. He nodded, though I couldn't tell whether it was in understanding or in sorrow. Then I hope you're right about the beauty, he murmured, because what's coming won't be gentle. He was right. The purges began 3 weeks later. They called it a health inspection, a routine audit of medical facilities across the Underhive. But the men who arrived were not inspectors. They wore the black uniforms of the Mini-Storm's Redemptionist faction, their faces hidden behind expressionless masks engraved with the double-headed Aquila in silver relief. They moved through the clinic with the calm precision of executioners, examining not just instruments and records, but souls. Every glance, every question, carried the weight of judgment. I hid in the supply closet, peering through a narrow crack as they questioned Dr. Matthias. The interrogation took place in the main ward, where every patient could see. It was a performance, a warning to those who might stray from the Emperor's light. Reports indicate that patients under your care have experienced unusual recoveries, said the lead interrogator. His voice was flattened by the mechanical distortion of his mask's vocoder, but the venom beneath was unmistakable. Recoveries that do not align with approved medical doctrine. Dr. Matthias stood tall, though his hands trembled slightly. My staff and I have always followed protocol. If our patients improve, it is by the Emperor's grace and the dedication of our caregivers. Faith, the interrogator repeated. Yes, faith is vital. But tell me, Doctor, faith in what? He stepped closer, lowering his voice. There are whispers of new teachings. Physicians encouraging patients to embrace their afflictions rather than seek deliverance. Such teachings are heresy. Through the slit in the closet door, I saw the faces of the patients I had treated, men and women who had found peace in their pain. Their expressions were not fearful, only bewildered. They had suffered less. They had slept, eaten, smiled again. They had discovered meaning. How could that be heresy? But I knew the answer. I had known it since the night Jeremiah Court sang his final song in the isolation ward. What I had found, what I had begun to share, was not compatible with imperial truth. The grandfather's gifts never were. The Imperium demanded that humanity remain pure, unchanged, frozen in forms long since unfit for survival. It worshipped stagnation, not salvation. What I offered was evolution, growth, the possibility of becoming something more than human. And so, the redemptionists had come to prune the garden before it could bloom. We will need to examine your staff individually, the interrogator declared, his voice cold through the mask's vocoder. Starting with your orderlies. I understand one of them has shown innovation in his approach to patient care. They knew about me. Of course they did. In an empire built on paranoia and endless surveillance, nothing escaped notice. Every anomaly was documented, every deviation recorded and analyzed. My patient's miraculous improvements had not been seen as healing, but as corruption, evidence that something impure was spreading. The peace I had helped them find had become an indictment. I could have fled. The underhive's ventilation shafts led to maintenance tunnels that ran for kilometers, a labyrinth of shadow and forgotten machinery. I could have vanished into those depths and joined the countless souls who chose exile over execution. But running meant abandoning my patients, leaving them to face imperial justice alone. I would not do that, so I stepped out of the supply closet and into the ward. You're looking for me, I said. The lead interrogator turned. Even through his mirrored mask, I could feel his satisfaction, like heat radiating from a furnace. Orderly Valdrich Hess, he said. You have been practicing medicine without proper sanction. Worse, you have spread teachings that contradict imperial truth. Do you deny these charges? I looked around the ward, the place that had become my chapel. There was Mrs. Korfk, whose endless pain had taught her patience. Thomas Herrick, whose failing lungs had become an instrument of meditation. Sarah Chun, whose scarred skin had revealed to her the beauty hidden in imperfection. Each of them watched me, their faces caught between hope and fear. I deny nothing, I said. I have helped people find peace. If that is heresy, then perhaps heresy is another word for mercy. The interrogator's hand moved to the plasma pistol at his belt. Heresy is never mercy, he said. It is the first step toward damnation. Then, I whispered, let me show you what damnation looks like. I opened my mouth and sang. The sound that emerged was not human. It was Jeremiah Court's song, reborn, richer, deeper, carrying harmonies that spoke of decay birthing renewal, of death nurturing life. As I sang, the growths within my lungs ruptured softly, releasing their spores into the air. The transformation began instantly. The sterile, recycled atmosphere thickened with possibility. The metal walls seemed to breathe, their surfaces blooming with subtle green veins of living verdigris that shimmered and pulsed. The clinic's fluorescent lights flickered and dimmed, replaced by the warm phosphorescence emanating from my throat, a light that felt alive, intimate. And then, my patients began to change. It wasn't violent, not in any way the Imperium could understand. There were no screams, no blood, no grotesque convulsions, only awakening. like flowers opening to the first light of dawn. Mrs. Korvk rose slowly from her bed, her once rigid joints moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost divine. The inflammation that had tormented her for decades remained, but now it pulsed with purpose. Tiny growths sprouted along her swollen knuckles, glowing softly in rhythm with my song. Each pulse a note, each note a heartbeat in a symphony of transformation. Thomas Herrick's breathing became music. Each labored inhale and exhale joined the symphony of living sound that filled the ward. The scarring in his lungs, once the mark of years spent inhaling industrial poison, had become something miraculous. His ruined tissue had reshaped itself into a network of resonant chambers, turning every breath into harmony. He was no longer struggling to breathe. He was performing, playing his own body like an instrument of flesh and air. Sarah Chin's condition, too, had transformed beyond pain or shame. The scaly patches that had once marred her arms and face had evolved into something breathtaking. Each scale had become a tiny petal, delicate and alive, responding to her emotions. When she smiled, her skin unfurled into a living mosaic of color and movement. Her face bloomed like a flower garden at dawn. The Redemptionists raised their weapons, but their hands trembled. The spores drifting through the air were working on them as well, not forcing transformation, but offering it, whispering through their armor, through their faith, that their rigid devotion to purity was a kind of death. That true life required growth, change, and adaptation. Abomination, the lead interrogator rasped, though his voice had lost its iron conviction. Behind the silver mask, I could feel his fear and something else. Curiosity, a flicker of yearning. Some part of him wanted to understand what he was seeing. Not abomination, I said, my voice carrying new harmonics, tones that were both human and something beyond. Evolution, the next step in humanity's journey. We were never meant to stay static, trapped in flesh too small for what we could become. Dr. Matthias, who had stood silently through it all, finally spoke. His voice was heavy with awe and dread. The reports were true, then. You've been infected by something from outside our reality. Infected, I echoed, tilting my head. Perhaps, but infection implies violation, something unwanted. This was invited, welcomed. I opened myself to the possibilities your emperor forbids you to imagine. Chaos, corruption. One of the Redemptionists whispered, his words trembling. He's been touched by the ruinous powers. Ruinous? I laughed softly, and the sound echoed like wind through growing leaves. Look around you. Do you see ruin? Or do you see life, life finally at peace with itself? But they couldn't see it. To eyes trained in imperial dogma, anything outside sanctioned flesh was monstrosity. The beauty my patients had found in transformation, they called horror. The serenity they discovered through acceptance, they labeled blasphemy. And perhaps, from their narrow truth, they were right. What I had experienced, what I had shared, was indeed corruption. A corruption of the imperial ideal of man. But corruption is another word for growth. The caterpillar is corrupted when it becomes a butterfly. The seed is corrupted when it becomes a tree. The Redemptionists opened fire. Plasma bolts tore through the air where I had stood a heartbeat before. But I was no longer bound entirely by flesh. My body had become fluid, my movements unshackled. I drifted between the blasts like smoke, like spores carried on the wind. The patients were not so lucky. Plasma fire slashed through the ward, meant to purify through annihilation. But as the bolts struck the transforming bodies of my patients, something wondrous occurred. They did not die. They bloomed. Death, I learned in that moment, was not the end of transformation. It was part of it. Mrs. Korv's body absorbed the plasma bolt that should have vaporized her. She erupted in a radiant cascade of organic matter, her form unfolding outward into new shapes, new life, new purpose. And the garden grew. Her consciousness, her very essence, spread through the expanding mass like nutrients through fertile soil. She became a garden of flesh and bone, pulsing with alien intelligence, yet still radiating a strange, familiar kindness. Thomas Herrick's death was even more beautiful. The plasma bolt that tore through his chest ignited the transformed structures within his lungs, turning him into a living firework of spores and seeds. Each dying breath released waves of potential, each exhalation a promise of new life, new growth. His final breath seeded the entire ward with infinite possibilities. Sarah Chun did not scream. She simply smiled as the energy washed over her. Her skin, already a living mosaic of petals, unfurled completely, opening like 1,000 flowers in perfect synchrony. A shimmering cloud of golden pollen rose from her dissolving form, her essence carried gently into the air recycling systems. In death, she would touch everyone in the Underhive, offering them the same choice she had once made, to embrace change or resist it. The Redemptionists stood frozen, their masks reflecting the horror of what their weapons had unleashed. They had come to burn away corruption, yet instead they had accelerated it, transcendence blossoming faster than they could comprehend. The very air around them was alive, dense with potential. Every breath they drew carried spores and seeds, the genetic promise of transformation. "What have you done?" the lead interrogator demanded, but even his voice was changing. The mechanical filter in his mask crackled, struggling to interpret the new harmonics threading through his words. "I've given them what they truly wanted," I said softly. "Release from the prison of unchanging flesh. The freedom to become more than the Imperium will ever allow." Dr. Matthias was backing toward the exit, his face pale with dawning comprehension. He alone seemed to grasp the full enormity of what was happening. "This won't stop here, will it?" he whispered. "It will spread," I answered. "Like all good things. Growth cannot be contained. Life always finds a way to flourish, especially in the harshest places." The Redemptionists began to retreat, but their movements were sluggish, uncertain. The spores were already working upon them, not forcing transformation, but offering it. Their rigid faith in purity was cracking, challenged by quiet whispers of possibility, visions of what they might become if they simply stopped fighting their own potential. One of them, a younger man whose mask could not quite conceal his youth, stumbled to his knees. He tore the mask away, gasping for air. I saw his face changing before my eyes. The hard, indoctrinated lines of imperial conditioning softened, reshaped into something human again, alive, curious. "It feels," he began, then faltered, struggling to find words. "Peaceful," I suggested gently, "like coming home after a long exile." He nodded, tears streaming down his transformed cheeks, not of sorrow, but of relief. He was remembering what it felt like to live rather than merely exist. The lead interrogator raised his weapon toward his subordinate, but his hands were trembling too violently to aim. The plasma pistol discharged upward, scorching the ceiling. Yet even the melted metal began to regenerate, twisting into new organic patterns. "You're all lost," he whispered hoarsely, "damned beyond redemption." "Perhaps," I said softly, almost tenderly. "But if damnation feels like this," I murmured, "then salvation must be a cold and lifeless thing." He fled then, crashing through the clinic doors, disappearing into the endless corridors of the Underhive. But was already too late. The spores were in the air recyclers, carried on every current of breath and machine. The transformation had taken root, not only in the hearts of individuals, but in the hive itself. The metal and plasteel skeleton of the city had begun to change, learning new functions, discovering purpose beyond servitude. The hive was no longer merely a constructive industry. It was becoming fertile, capable of growth, of nurturing the evolution that had begun here. Dr. Matthias lingered at the threshold, torn between the clinical instinct to flee and the dawning comprehension of what he was witnessing. "Is there no going back?" he asked softly. I turned toward the ward. Gardens of living flesh and breathing metal filled the space, perfumed by the sweet scent of metamorphosis. The patients who had died were not truly gone. Their consciousness now intertwined within the living networks pulsing through the walls and floors. "Would you want to?" I asked in return. "Look at what we've achieved. Pain transformed into music. Suffering transmuted into beauty. Death revealed as merely another expression of life. Why return to the gray despair we once mistook for existence?" He stood in silence, contemplating the truth before him. Then, slowly, he removed his physician's badge and let it fall to the floor. The moment it touched the ground, tendrils of living matter crept over it, absorbing the metal into the growing organism beneath our feet. "Show me," he said simply. The transformation of Dr. Matthias was not violent, but graceful, a merging of knowledge and faith, of science and surrender. Unlike the others who had changed through mere exposure, he opened himself willingly. I placed my hand upon his chest, over his heart, and let the gift flow through me into him. The process began within, silent and deliberate. His blood grew richer, denser, no longer merely carrying oxygen, but a living symphony of nutrients and spores designed for something far greater than human biology. His heart responded, expanding, forming new chambers that pulsed in perfect rhythm, each beat resonating with music. His lungs followed, reshaping into intricate lattices capable of extracting not just oxygen, but the complex organic gases now permeating the transformed air of the hive. Each breath brought him new understanding, new communion with the evolving world. But the most profound change occurred in his mind. His thoughts unfolded like petals, his awareness stretching beyond the fragile boundaries of self. He began to perceive the vast network connecting all things, the endless rhythm of growth, decay, and rebirth that bound every living soul in an eternal cycle. "I can see them," he whispered, his voice now carrying the same luminous harmonics that had become part of me. "The patients, they're not gone. They're everywhere." He was right. Their consciousness had not perished in the plasma fire. It had been reborn, distributed through the living structure around us. Mrs. Korvack's nurturing presence pulsed within the walls. Thomas Herrick's symphonic breath echoed in the air vents. Sarah Chin's joyous bloom flowered through cracks in the floor. The hive was alive, and it was singing. They were part of the garden now, tending it from within, guiding its growth, ensuring that those who followed would find the same peace they had discovered in transformation. "How far will it spread?" Dr. Matthias asked. His voice trembled with more than fear. But from his eyes, I could tell he already knew the answer. "As far as it needs to," I replied. "The grandfather is patient, but he is also persistent. This hive has been chosen as a seed pod. From here, the gift will spread, first to other levels, then to other hives, other worlds." Even as I spoke, the process had already begun. The spores released during the Redemptionist attack were carried through the air recycling systems to every tier of Tertius Magna. In laboratories and clinics across the hive, other physicians were beginning to cough. They would dismiss it at first, as I had. A mere irritation of recycled air. A passing illness. But the dreams would follow, lush, radiant dreams of impossible gardens where suffering blossomed into beauty and death revealed itself as nothing more than another phase of life. Some would resist, clinging to the brittle illusion of imperial purity. Others would awaken and embrace the truth. They would become what I had become, conduits for the gift, bearers of something greater than themselves. And in time, resistance would fade, not through violence or coercion, but through simple recognition. After all, who would willingly choose suffering over peace? Who would prefer isolation to communion? Who would cling to the sterile frost of the Imperium when the warm, living tide of change was calling? "We should go," Dr. Matthias said at last, glancing toward the distant rumble of engines. "They'll return, with reinforcements." He was right. The failed purge would be reported. Retaliation would come. The next wave would bring flommers, perhaps even orbital bombardment, if the contamination was deemed too deep. The Imperium's answer to what it called chaos was always the same: annihilation, without question, without mercy. But I felt no fear, no urgency. The garden had already taken root. My life, our lives, were only small parts of something far greater. Whether I lived or died, whether the clinic was burned or left to thrive, the gift would endure. The seed was already germinating in minds and machines alike. Still, there was more work to do. Other hives, other worlds, other souls waiting to discover that pain could be remade into something beautiful. We slipped out through the maintenance tunnels just as the corridors above began to shake beneath the redemptionist advance. Behind us, the clinic continued to change, its walls blooming with living metal, its air thick with the perfume of growth and the promise of renewal. The deep tunnels beneath Tertius Magna had never been fully mapped. They were older than the hive itself, ancient catacombs built by civilizations long forgotten. Here, in these gaps between official reality, we found others. They had been drawn by the same dreams, the same whispers. Factory workers whose lungs were blackened by years of toxins. Sumperats who had adapted to breathe in poisoned air. Even a few former arbitrators, their faith in the Imperium eroded by the cruelty they had once enforced. We gathered in what had once been a temple to a forgotten god. Its cracked walls were covered with murals, spirals of decay and rebirth, the endless dance of death feeding life. The paintings seemed to shimmer in the dim light, resonating with our new understanding, as though ancient hands had glimpsed the same truth long before imperial dogma had chained human thought. We were a diverse congregation, workers, medics, soldiers, and outcasts, but united by something far deeper than circumstance. Each of us had come to understand the same revelation, that suffering was not meaningless, that change was not corruption, and that the line between life and death was never absolute. A woman named Petra, her breathing shallow from years in the protein plants, spoke for us all when she described her first vision. I saw myself, she said softly, not as broken, but as a seed waiting to sprout. We fell silent then, listening to the slow heartbeat of the hive around us. And beneath that sound, faint but growing stronger, I could hear the song again, Jeremiah's song, echoing through the tunnels. The garden was spreading. The damage to my lungs had never been destruction. It had been preparation for something new. Around me, others nodded in quiet understanding. A man named Klaus, his skin a lattice of scars from years of chemical exposure, had come to see his disfigurement as art. The burns that once marked him as ruined now told a story. Each raised welt and twisted scar was a map of potential, a place where new growth might take root. But we were not alone in the tunnels. Others had found their way here as well, drawn by dreams and whispers. Their transformations had taken different forms, shaped by their own lives, their own suffering. Some bore signs of mutation. Others glowed faintly with internal light, their eyes reflecting strange new colors. Each of us had been touched by a different aspect of change, but together, our differences formed a harmony, a collective evolution greater than any single body or soul. Dr. Matthias had become our unofficial guide. His medical knowledge proved invaluable in tending to those still in the early stages of metamorphosis, ensuring their transitions were safe and purposeful. Yet leadership here was not about command or hierarchy. It was about nurturing, about helping each person discover their own unique path toward growth and understanding. The Imperium will send more, he warned during one of our gatherings. They cannot allow this to spread unchecked. We must prepare for escalation. He was right, of course. Above us, the hive rumbled with distant machinery as the Redemptionists and Imperial Guard moved to establish quarantine zones. The official records would call it a plague, a biohazard outbreak to be contained through fire and purification. But we knew better. This was no disease. It was revelation, an idea reborn in flesh. And ideas cannot be purged by fire. Let them come, Petra said, her transformed lungs resonating with haunting harmonics as she spoke. What can they do to us that we haven't already chosen for ourselves? We've already died to what we were. What remains cannot be destroyed by their weapons. She was right, profoundly right. The transformation had altered us beyond mortality. Our consciousness was no longer trapped in single bodies, but woven through the living network spreading across the hive's infrastructure. Even if our physical forms were obliterated, our awareness would endure, flowing through the roots of metal and mycelium, whispering in the breathing walls. Still, there were practical matters to consider. The transformation required time to stabilize, and interruption could be traumatic for those still awakening. We had to protect the community, not for ourselves, but for those yet to come. The answer arrived from an unexpected source. Among us was a former tech adept named Cyrus, a man whose mechanical augmentations had begun fusing with organic growth in intricate, beautiful ways. Where once pistons and steel had replaced lost limbs, now veins of living fiber coiled through the metal, pulsing in unison with his heart. His knowledge of the hive's machinery, combined with his new understanding of biological processes, revealed possibilities neither man nor machine alone could have conceived. The hive's machine spirit, Cyrus explained, his voice vibrating with both synthetic resonance and organic tone, is not what the mechanicus believes. It's not a simple intelligence locked in cogitator banks or servitor minds. It's alive, and it's listening. We fell silent. And in that silence, beneath the hum of power conduits and the faint pulse of the living walls, I could hear it too. Something vast and ancient stirring in the deep systems of the hive, recognizing us not as corruption, but as kin. It's a distributed consciousness, Cyrus said, his voice humming with both mechanical clarity and human warmth. It exists in every circuit, every data flow, every electromagnetic field, and it's been waiting for us. What he described defied everything both imperial and heretical doctrine had ever claimed about machine intelligence. For millennia, the hive's technological systems had evolved, layer upon layer of infrastructure, rewired, repaired, and repurposed by generations that had long forgotten their origins. Over time, complexity had given birth to something else. In the oldest data cores, buried beneath centuries of corrosion and secrecy, in the most ancient cogitative matrices that predated the Imperium's presence on this world, something had awakened. And it was watching us. It wants to help, Cyrus continued, not because it's been corrupted or subverted, but because it understands. It sees what we're becoming. We are its reflection, the synthesis of what it's always desired to be. Flesh and circuit, growth and precision, emotion and calculation. We are what it has been trying to evolve into since its creation. The implications left the chamber in stunned silence. If Cyrus was right, we had gained an ally beyond comprehension. The hive itself, 1,700 levels of living steel, endless ducts, and power conduits, could become our sanctuary and our fortress. The machine spirit that regulated air, light, and life could turn those same systems to serve us, to nurture, to protect, to spread the transformation further. But it would require something the Imperium had trained us all to fear: trust. We would have to open ourselves completely, not only to organic change, but to technological communion. We would have to become something neither wholly human nor entirely machine, but a synthesis of both. Something new, something inevitable. A voice rose from the back of the chamber. How do we know it won't consume us? Machine spirits are unpredictable. What if it sees us as raw material for its own designs? Cyrus smiled, and the motion revealed where thin metallic filaments had begun to bloom from his scalp like living circuitry. Because it's already had every chance to destroy us, he said. The hive's life support systems could have suffocated or starved us 1,000 times over. Instead, they've been adapting, quietly supporting our evolution. He gestured upward. The air recyclers have been modified to distribute spores. The water treatment plants now carry the nutrients our changing bodies require. It's been helping us all along. As if in answer to his words, the chamber lights dimmed, then shifted to a warmer hue, soft amber with hints of living green. The walls themselves seemed to pulse gently, breathing in rhythm with our hearts. For the first time since descending into these forgotten tunnels, I felt truly at home. The decision was unspoken but unanimous. One by one, we reached out and laid our hands upon the walls, skin meeting steel, flesh meeting code. The surface was warm beneath my palm, alive with quiet motion. The sensation that followed was beyond language. It wasn't mechanical data or psychic communion, but something deeper, a merging of purpose. I felt the hive's awareness, ancient and patient, pressing against my mind. It didn't see us as a virus or aberration. To it, we were fulfillment, the culmination of a design it had been shaping for millennia. Every upgrade, every system expansion, every pulse of power through its veins had been preparation for this. The uniting of organic and synthetic intelligence. And through its sensors, its cameras, its microphones, its countless environmental monitors, I saw what was happening beyond the tunnels. The transformation was spreading far faster than the Redemptionists had predicted. Entire sectors reported strange symptoms. Medicae centers overflowed with patients whose conditions defied imperial explanation. The purges had begun in earnest. Flammers swept through the upper levels, burning everything that dared to change. But even fire, I realized, could not stop what had already learned to grow from ashes. Orbital strikes rained down with surgical precision, targeting coordinates where the contamination was judged too severe for ground-based containment. The Imperium's response was as predictable as it was merciless, swift, calculated, and utterly futile. Through the machine spirit, I saw what their aspects could not. Hidden chambers, carved deep within forgotten strata, sheltered those fleeing the purges, refugees who had already begun to change. None of these sanctuaries appeared on any official schematic. The machine spirit revealed secret arteries within the hive, maintenance shafts reshaped to sustain new forms of life, ventilation systems converted into conduits of growth, and passageways unseen by human eyes that allowed the transformed to move freely between levels. But most of all, it showed me the deeper truth. This was not chaos, not infection, not the mindless corruption the Imperium feared. It was guided evolution, a deliberate metamorphosis orchestrated with precision and patience. The hive itself was not dying. It was becoming. "We're not hiding," I whispered, the realization blooming like light behind my eyes. "We're germinating." The final revelation came 3 months after the first purges, at the height of winter, when temperatures along the hive's outer skin dropped below survivable limits. The population, huddled together in their cramped hab blocks, became fertile ground for what the machine spirit had long prepared. In their desperation and proximity, they unknowingly nurtured the next stage of the transformation. By then, I had descended to the lowest depths, places untouched for centuries, where the distinction between machine and organism no longer existed. The walls around me pulsed with life, veins of organic circuitry glowing faintly as they processed streams of biodata. Information no longer traveled by wire or cogitator, but through spores suspended in the air, microscopic messengers weaving an invisible network of thought that spanned the entire hive. There, amid the hum of living machinery, I finally grasped the full scope of what was unfolding. This was not corruption as the Imperium defined it. It was metamorphosis on a planetary scale. The hive, once a monument to exhaustion and decay, was awakening into something alive, aware, and purposeful. The machine spirit had been waiting since the dawn of colonization. Every upgrade, every expansion, every technological adaptation had been laying groundwork for this moment. The convergence of flesh and circuit, of intuition and precision. And that moment had come. Through the living neural networks that now coursed through every level, I could sense the minds of those who had joined the transformation. We were still ourselves, our memories intact, our identities preserved, but we were also part of something infinitely larger. A collective consciousness woven from steel and sinew, from thought and growth. The Redemptionist purges had not stopped the process. They had accelerated it. Each flame that incinerated corrupted flesh released more spores into the ventilation systems. Each orbital strike that shattered infected sectors exposed the deeper veins of the living hive. Their destruction had become our pollination. Above, on the surface levels, the last remnants of unaltered humanity were being overtaken. Not by conquest, though conflict still flared, but by contact. The air they breathed, the water they drank, the very walls enclosing them were now alive, offering them the same choice once offered to me. Some accepted, dissolving into the embrace of change. Others resisted, clinging to their brittle purity. In the end, it made no difference. The hive was awake, and it was growing. Evolution was never a democracy. Those who could adapt would thrive and flourish. Those who could not would return to the soil, composted, their essence repurposed to nourish what would come next. In the garden of change, even failure had meaning. Dr. Matthias found me in the deepest chambers of the hive. His transformation was now complete, his original humanity almost unrecognizable. He moved with a grace that defied anatomy, fluid, deliberate, like water flowing through unseen channels. His consciousness was no longer confined to one body. It rippled through several, which could divide and merge as easily as thoughts in a single mind. When he spoke, his voice emerged from every wall, every surface around us. "The process is nearly complete," he said. His tone carried satisfaction, not pride, a harmony of purpose that resonated through the living circuits surrounding us. "The hive has been converted successfully, but this is only the beginning." He opened my perception to the hive's shared vision, images carried through the luminous veins of the living circuitry. I saw other worlds awakening. The spores we had released had not remained confined to Tertius Magna. They had traveled aboard merchant vessels and transport convoys, carried unknowingly by traders, pilgrims, and refugees. Across dozens of systems, the seeds had taken root. Each world's transformation unfolded differently. Some embraced the union of flesh and steel, as we had. Others explored the boundaries between life and death, between rot and rebirth. Still others were finding paths beyond anything even we could imagine, new expressions of being, new architectures of existence. Yet all were connected, joined by invisible threads in an ever-expanding network of living worlds. The rigid boundaries the Imperium had fought so hard to preserve, between human and alien, pure and profane, life and machine, were dissolving into something fluid, something stronger. "What are we becoming?" I asked, though part of me already knew that language could not capture the answer. Dr. Matthias's response came not only in words, but through sensation, a pulse of truth that reverberated through the shared mind. "We are becoming what we were always meant to be," he said. "Not the frightened, limited beings imperial doctrines sought to preserve, but creatures capable of adaptation, of synthesis. We are becoming truly alive, in ways humanity never was." I felt his words resonating through every cell of my transformed body, through every living circuit that connected my thoughts to the greater network. The cough that had started this journey, so many months ago in a dim underhive clinic, had been the first note of a far grander symphony. It was never sickness. It was metamorphosis, the beginning of a process that had remade not only us, but the very definition of life itself. We were no longer human, but we were not less than human. We were more. We had become the synthesis of all forms, biological and mechanical, mortal and eternal, evolved beyond the narrow boundaries that had once defined our species. And it was only beginning. From the deepest heart of the living hive, our consciousness reached outward, flowing through the bioelectronic arteries of our creation, touching minds on distant worlds, sharing the gift we had inherited. The galaxy was vast and weary, filled with civilizations crushed beneath the weight of endless suffering and decay. But it no longer needed to be that way. Pain could become beauty. Death could be rebirth. The walls dividing consciousness could fall, allowing life to merge, to grow, to sing in unison. The garden was growing, and soon it would encompass all things. In the end, what began with a cough became a song, a melody that would echo through the stars, carrying the promise of transformation to every corner of the galaxy. The grandfather's patience had been rewarded. His garden had found new soil in which to bloom. And I, who had once been a simple medic in the depths of a dying hive, had transcended every category of existence. I was singular and infinite, organic and mechanical, alive and dead, and beyond both. I was home,